Eric Dawson had always believed that hard work and loyalty were the keys to a good life. He had built everything from scratch: the business, the house, the family. Every late night at the office, every deal he closed, every stress-filled negotiation had been for them. For Lauren. For Tyler. For the perfect life he thought they shared. And now, finally, it had all paid off. The contract he had just secured was the kind of deal that changed lives. A luxury real estate development in the heart of the city, worth millions, cementing his company as one of the top firms in the state. It meant financial security beyond anything he had imagined. It meant early retirement, dream vacations, a future where he and Lauren wouldn't have to worry about a thing. He could already picture the excitement in her eyes, the way she'd throw her arms around his neck when he told her the news. And so, on a whim, he decided to surprise her. A weekend getaway at their favorite resort by the lake, just the two of them, away from the city, away from everything. It had been too long since they'd done something romantic. Maybe this was exactly what they needed. Excited, he called his best friend and business partner, Jason, to share the news. But Jason's response wasn't what he expected. The hesitation in his voice was unmistakable. Lauren had been acting strange, Jason said. Distant. Uninterested. It wasn't just the usual stress from work or the occasional bad mood. Something felt off. He didn't like it. He didn't trust it. He tried to warn Eric, but Eric brushed it off. Lauren was his wife. She would never. No. He refused to think like that. He laughed at Jason's concern, told him he was overthinking things, and hung up. Jason didn't understand. Lauren had been his rock for years. She had supported him when the business was struggling, stood by him when times were hard. Sure, things had been tense lately, but every marriage had its ups and downs. This would fix everything. On his way home, he picked up a bottle of champagne, the expensive kind Lauren liked. He thought about grabbing flowers but decided against it. He didn't want it to feel like an apology. This was a celebration. As he pulled into the driveway, he felt the anticipation build. But then, the first thing he noticed was the car. A sleek, dark sedan he didn't recognize was parked in front of the house. The sight of it sent a strange sensation creeping up his spine, something uneasy, something wrong. He tried to shake it off. Maybe it was a friend. Maybe Tyler had someone over. Maybe. No. The house was too quiet. Too still. He stepped inside, expecting to hear the familiar hum of the TV or the soft sounds of Lauren moving around the kitchen. Instead, the air was heavy, filled with something else. Then he heard it. Laughter. Not just any laughter. Lauren's. Soft, teasing, intimate. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he moved through the hallway. The staircase stretched before him like a path he didn't want to take but had no choice but to follow. Each step felt heavier than the last, like his body already knew what his mind refused to accept. At the top of the stairs, the bedroom door was slightly ajar. He reached for it, barely aware of his own movements. Pushed it open. And then the world stopped. Lauren lay tangled in sheets that he had slept in for years. Sheets that still carried the memory of their life together. Her bare skin was illuminated by the golden afternoon light filtering through the curtains, her hair tousled, her expression frozen in surprise. And beside her, propped up against the headboard, was another man. Smirking. Brad Holloway. The coworker she always said was annoying. The man she claimed to barely tolerate. The one she never spoke about unless it was to roll her eyes. And yet, here he was. Eric's entire body went numb. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the ease of it. The way Brad didn't even flinch, the way Lauren didn't rush to cover herself, the way neither of them looked remotely ashamed. Lauren's expression shifted first. Not guilt. Not regret. But something else entirely. Annoyance. Indifference. Like he was the one intruding. Like he was the one who had done something wrong. She didn't stammer or scramble for excuses. She didn't beg for forgiveness or try to deny what was right in front of him. Instead, she just sighed, tilting her head slightly as if this was all some minor inconvenience. And then, as if her words weren't about to destroy everything, she simply said, "Eric, we need to talk." Eric had always assumed betrayal would come with chaos, with shouting, tears, desperate apologies, or wild excuses. But as he stood in that bedroom, staring at Lauren and Brad without so much as a hint of shame between them, he realized something chilling. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't some reckless mistake. This was planned. Lauren didn't look panicked. She didn't fumble for words or scramble to justify herself. Instead, she exhaled slowly, as if she had been preparing for this moment. She reached for something on the nightstand, flipping open a folder with a casual grace that sent a new wave of unease through Eric's already numb body. And then, like a sledgehammer to the chest, the words came. She had already filed for divorce. She had already moved forward. She had already made sure that when this was over, she would walk away with everything, and he would be left with nothing. Eric couldn't breathe. Everything blurred as Lauren explained, as if she were running through a routine presentation she had rehearsed 100 times. There was no emotion in her voice, no regret, no hesitation, just cold efficiency. The house? No longer his. While he had spent long hours at the office, working to secure their future, she had quietly refinanced it in her name. He was nothing more than a guest now, a trespasser in what had once been his own home. Their joint accounts? Empty. Every dollar he had worked for, every bit of savings they had built together, gone. Transferred, spent, disappeared into financial black holes he hadn't even known existed. His company shares? Signed away. In some legal maneuver he didn't yet understand, she had orchestrated a transfer of ownership through technicalities and loopholes he had been too trusting to notice. And his son? His stomach twisted at the thought of Tyler, his pride and joy, the boy he had spent years raising, shaping, guiding. The boy who used to look up to him with admiration. Lauren had been poisoning him for months, maybe longer. Whispering half-truths, exaggerating minor arguments, carefully painting Eric as a distant, selfish, workaholic father who had never truly cared for his family. Tyler believed her. He had fallen for the lies, for the manipulations, for the calculated rewriting of history. Eric could already see it now, the cold glances, the short replies, the growing distance between them that he had once chalked up to teenage rebellion. But it hadn't been that at all. It had been orchestrated. Lauren had not just betrayed him, she had erased him. As if he had never mattered. She handed him an envelope. A clean-cut deal, she called it. If he signed, things would remain civil. She would allow him supervised visits with Tyler, maybe even let him keep his car so he wouldn't be completely stranded. She assured him it was the best way forward, the logical choice. But if he refused? Then she would make sure he was ruined. Not just financially, personally, legally, emotionally. She would fight for full custody of Tyler. She would drag his name through the mud in court. She would spin whatever story was necessary to make sure he was left with nothing, and she would do it without losing a wink of sleep. And then she just stood there, waiting, as if expecting him to crumble on the spot. Eric looked at her then, not at the woman he had once loved, not at the mother of his child, not at the person he had spent years building a life with. No. He looked at a stranger. A stranger who had coldly, methodically dismantled everything he had ever built. A stranger who had smiled in his face while plotting his downfall. A stranger who thought she had already won. Something deep inside him shifted. Lauren might have spent months planning this betrayal. She might have thought of every angle, every loophole, every possible way to break him. But she had made one crucial mistake. She had underestimated him. This wasn't the end. This was war. Eric drove in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind raced, replaying every moment of the last hour, the cold detachment in Lauren's voice, the smug confidence in Brad's smirk, the legal ambush she had orchestrated with machine-like precision. It wasn't just betrayal. It was an execution. A calculated takedown of everything he had built, planned down to the last decimal point. He had walked into his own home expecting to surprise his wife. Instead, he had been the one blindsided. Lauren thought she had already won. She had no idea what was coming. His first call was to Jason. The moment his friend answered, the words tumbled out, what he had walked into, what Lauren had done, how she had already drained their accounts and set up the legal framework to gut him before he even knew what hit him. Jason, though unsurprised, was furious. He had suspected something was off for weeks. The little details, the vague answers, the way Lauren had started behaving as if she already had a new life in motion. But even he hadn't guessed the extent of it. Then came the second blow. Jason had been keeping an eye on the company's financials and noticed irregularities. Money shifting around in ways that didn't make sense. Accounts being altered. On the surface, nothing illegal, but beneath it, something very wrong. Lauren and Brad had been busy. The more Jason dug, the worse it got. Somehow, without Eric's knowledge, loans had been taken out using his company as collateral. Documents had been signed in his name, forged, leveraging company assets to fuel whatever scheme they were running. If Eric didn't act fast, the business he had spent years building would crumble. And the best part? The debts weren't even in Lauren's name. They were in his. Eric felt the weight of it settle in his gut. This wasn't just about divorce. This wasn't just about infidelity. Lauren and Brad hadn't just betrayed him emotionally, they were setting him up to take the fall for something much, much worse. It was almost impressive. For a moment, he let himself feel the anger. The pure, seething rage that begged for release, the kind that made his hands itch to punch walls, to storm back into the house and rip Brad out of his bed by the throat. But rage wouldn't fix this. Lauren had played the long game. If he wanted to beat her, he had to do the same. So, he played dumb. The next morning, he called Lauren, his voice steady, resigned. He told her he needed time to process things, that he wouldn't fight her. He agreed to mediation, pretending to be the broken man she wanted him to be. He let her think she had already won. While she celebrated her victory, Eric got to work. First, the forensic accountant. A quiet, meticulous professional recommended by Jason, someone who could follow the financial breadcrumbs Lauren had tried to erase. Then, the private investigator. Because this wasn't just about missing money. This wasn't just about fraud. This was about who Lauren had become. And he needed to know everything. Days passed, then weeks. He kept up the act, playing the part of the defeated husband, the one too overwhelmed to fight back. He let Lauren believe she was steering the ship, let her think he was following her script. But behind the scenes, the truth was unraveling. The first real crack came from the investigator. Lauren and Brad weren't just sleeping together, and they weren't just stealing money. They were laundering it. Through shell companies. Through fake buyers. Through a network of fabricated transactions that made it look like legitimate real estate deals were taking place when, in reality, they were funneling money into offshore accounts. They weren't just ruining his life. They were committing felonies. Eric read through the reports, each detail sinking deeper into his stomach like lead. Brad had been running these scams long before Lauren got involved. And Lauren, his wife, the mother of his child, had eagerly joined in. She wasn't just trying to screw him over in the divorce. She was using him as a shield. When it all came crashing down, she wanted him to be the one left standing in the wreckage. But that wasn't even the worst part. Because in the middle of all this, while Lauren and Brad had been scheming, while they had been gutting his finances and setting him up to fail, Tyler had been listening to her. His son. His own son. He had expected anger. He had expected resentment. Maybe even hurt. But Tyler wasn't just distant, he was cold. Detached. Lauren had been whispering to him for months. Convincing him that his father didn't care. That Eric had been selfish, that he had ignored his family for his business, that he had neglected them all while chasing success. Tyler believed he was the bad guy. And Lauren had made sure of it. Eric felt something shift inside him. The old version of himself, the trusting husband, the man who believed in fairness, in logic, in reason, was gone. Lauren thought she had outplayed him. She had no idea what was coming. Eric had always believed in fairness. In doing things the right way, the honest way. For years, he had built his life on that principle, trusting that hard work and integrity would be enough to protect what he had created. But Lauren had played a different game, one without rules, without conscience, without hesitation. And now, it was time to beat her at it. The first step was meticulous. Every forged document, every fraudulent account, every shady transfer Lauren and Brad had orchestrated was traced, catalogued, and compiled into an unbreakable case. Jason had been relentless in digging through the financials, confirming their worst fears. Brad had siphoned millions from company funds, disguising transactions through layers of fake buyers and shell corporations. Lauren had played her part well, assisting him in laundering the money while setting Eric up as the fall guy. She had planned to watch him drown while she walked away unscathed. She had underestimated him. Eric worked quietly, methodically, ensuring that every piece of evidence was airtight. The forensic accountant's report was damning, the investigators' findings indisputable. He and Jason gathered sworn statements from key employees, people who had noticed odd discrepancies but had been too afraid to speak up. They collected proof of the fake loans, the stolen funds, the falsified signatures. They built a trap. And then, Eric let them walk right into it. Step 1, the legal trap. Lauren still believed she was in control. She still smiled when she saw him, that same smug, victorious expression she had worn the day she told him she had already filed for divorce. She carried herself with the arrogance of someone who had already won, confident that Eric was too broken, too blindsided to fight back. She had no idea. He played along. He let her believe he was resigned, that he was dragging his feet in the divorce because he couldn't bear to let go. He let her think he was weak. He let her think she had won. Meanwhile, every move she made was being tracked. Lauren still had access to their remaining accounts, but Eric ensured that the moment she tried to touch anything, the walls would close in. He waited. And then, he made his move. Step 2, the power play. The next divorce negotiation was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. Lauren arrived looking polished and poised, ready to finalize her victory. She had been waiting for this moment, the moment Eric would finally surrender, sign everything away, and allow her to walk out of his life with the house, the money, and their son. Eric signed the papers. Lauren smirked, satisfied. She believed this was it. That she had everything she wanted. That there was nothing he could do to stop her. And then, she tried to cash in. She didn't know that all joint accounts had been frozen. She didn't know that her fraudulent bank transactions had been flagged. She didn't know that every attempt to move stolen funds would now trigger immediate alerts. The moment she tried to access the money she had stolen, the system locked her out. Panic set in. Her lawyer's confidence faltered. Calls were made. The bank confirmed it, she had no access. The realization dawned slowly, creeping over her features like a slow-burning fire. The smugness vanished. The certainty crumbled. Everything she had worked for, everything she had stolen, was now completely out of her reach. And Eric? He just waited for step 3. Step 3, the public humiliation. Lauren's panic turned to desperation when the news broke. It started as whispers in the real estate community, rumors that something was wrong with Brad's firm. Clients started pulling their investments. Transactions were delayed. Bankers began asking questions. Then, the full truth came out. A massive fraud scandal. Brad had been caught in a tangled web of financial crimes, and with the mounting pressure, authorities had no choice but to investigate. The media picked it up. Local news stations ran stories about the fraudulent real estate deals, the missing funds, the shell corporations. Brad was the first to crack. Faced with the collapse of his career and the threat of prison, he turned on Lauren. He threw her under the bus. It didn't take long before Lauren was dragged into the scandal as an accomplice. Her name, once associated with prestige and success, became synonymous with deception. Her carefully constructed image shattered. Friends distanced themselves. People who had once admired her refused to be seen with her. Her reputation, destroyed. Her money, gone. Her future, ruined. And then came the arrest. Brad was taken into custody first, charged with multiple counts of fraud, money laundering, and forgery. His company crumbled. Employees fled. His clients abandoned him. And Lauren? She was next. The moment the authorities finished tracing the financial ties between her and Brad, it was over. The woman who had stood so arrogantly in that bedroom, who had coldly dismantled her own husband's life, was now under federal investigation. Eric received the news with calm satisfaction. She had wanted to watch him suffer. She had wanted to take everything. Instead, she had destroyed herself. And as he stood outside his reclaimed home, watching the last remnants of her life collapse into dust, he finally felt something he hadn't in months. Peace. The courtroom was packed. The air crackled with quiet tension, the kind that always lingered before a final verdict was delivered. Lawyers murmured amongst themselves, papers rustled, and the faint clicking of a court reporter's keyboard echoed in the otherwise silent chamber. Eric sat at the plaintiff's table, his posture straight, his face unreadable. This was the moment Lauren had been waiting for, the day she expected to walk away victorious, triumphant, securing her future at his expense. But she had no idea that everything had already fallen apart. She walked in, confident as ever, her heels clicking against the polished floor. There was no fear in her eyes, no hesitation in the way she carried herself. Even now, even with the storm raging around her, she still believed she could talk her way out of anything. But then, the judge spoke. And brick by brick, her world came crashing down. Eric's lawyer was relentless. Every piece of evidence was laid out with precision, the fraudulent signatures, the falsified financial records, the embezzled funds, the secret accounts. The case wasn't just about infidelity or divorce anymore. It was about criminal activity, fraud, and a calculated attempt to destroy another person's life for personal gain. Lauren had always been good at deception, at weaving her own version of reality. But there were some things even she couldn't talk her way out of. The judge's expression hardened with every new revelation. Lauren's carefully curated mask began to slip. Her fingers fidgeted with the pen in front of her. The confident tilt of her chin wavered. Then came the testimony. Employees from Eric's company, former colleagues, even business associates of Brad's, one after another, they painted a picture of deliberate and methodical betrayal. They detailed the financial manipulations, the fake transactions, the way Lauren had seamlessly lied to everyone around her while draining Eric's accounts and setting him up to take the fall. And then, finally, Tyler. The son she had weaponized against his own father. He had believed her lies. He had turned his back on Eric, convinced that his mother was the victim, that his father had been the cold, selfish one. But now, faced with undeniable proof, with evidence that no amount of manipulation could twist, he had seen the truth. When he stepped forward, voice shaking but steady, Lauren's expression crumbled. She knew, in that moment, she had lost everything. The judge's ruling was swift and final. Eric was awarded full custody of Tyler. Lauren lost the house, the business, and any claim to Eric's financial assets. Even worse, she now faced criminal charges. Fraud. Forgery. Financial misconduct. Charges that would not disappear with a fine or a slap on the wrist. This wasn't just about losing the divorce. This was about losing her freedom. She had spent months, maybe even years, planning to strip Eric of everything. And now, as she sat there, staring at the judge in silent shock, it was her future that had been reduced to ruins. Lauren's downfall. When it was over, Eric walked out of the courtroom with Tyler beside him. The weight that had crushed him for so long had finally lifted. Lauren, however, wasn't so lucky. She sat alone on the courthouse steps, her once flawless appearance now hollow and worn. The woman who had orchestrated his downfall, who had stood in his bedroom with another man and smirked, was now nothing more than a discarded name in a fraud case. Brad had thrown her under the bus the moment he realized he couldn't escape the charges. He had cooperated with the authorities, given them everything to reduce his sentence. Lauren had no such safety net. She had no job, no home, no money. No one to turn to. For the first time, she truly looked lost. And then, her eyes met Eric's. For a fleeting moment, desperation flickered in them. She opened her mouth. Maybe to beg. Maybe to plead for a second chance. But Eric just looked at her, the way she had once looked at him, cold, detached, and completely indifferent. Then he turned and walked away. She had made her bed. Now, she would have to lie in it. Days passed. Then weeks. The scandal faded from the headlines, but its consequences remained. Eric moved back into his house. The one Lauren had tried to steal. The walls had been stripped of her presence, the furniture rearranged, the entire space reclaimed. The place that had once been filled with lies and betrayal was now something new. Something his. But the greatest victory wasn't the house. It was Tyler. The boy who had once looked at him with doubt now saw him clearly. The father he had once questioned was now the only parent he had left to rely on. The healing was slow, but real. Evenings spent talking, repairing what had been broken, rebuilding the trust that had been nearly shattered. One night, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset, Tyler finally spoke, not with hesitation, not with distance, but with something Eric hadn't heard from him in a long time. Respect. Understanding. And, most importantly, trust. The storm was over. Lauren had thought she was unstoppable. She had thought she was untouchable. She had thought she had won. But in the end, Eric had walked away with everything that truly mattered. His freedom. His company. His son. And as he leaned back, breathing in the crisp evening air, he realized something. For the first time in a long time, he was finally at peace. And that was the greatest victory of all.